Hello everyone, this is Hero from the Birds, and I have another video for you developing the concept of the UI for Shadowlands. Of course, our user interface is a very central part to our play in PvE, and so in this video and others in the series, we focus on thinking about each stage of building a UI. Some of you have been playing the game for a long time, and you don't need any of this, so you can just feel free to skip this video. But you might find there's a few hints or tips about developing specifically a utility bar or some information for all of your utility spells that will help you to use them more often and therefore be more helpful to your group. This is, again, just for PvE content, and I'm going to follow along with a central tenet of my rotational video, which was that we want to centralize information. It's really difficult for the eye to constantly be going to the corners of your screen to find information when you are in a game that follows around a character at the very center of it. And so if there's information about something to do with movement or some kind of defensive or a dispel, and it's located way over here on the left of my screen, I'm going to take a lot of extra time, as it were, even though it's only a split second, but it builds up over time to double check if these sorts of things are available to me. What we want to do is eliminate some of that, and just like with the rotational placement, we want to place our utility in a central location. So I'm using something like a weak aura here, so this is tell me when, and it has a bar of utility that follows below my bar of rotational information. And this can be, less opacity if you like. It doesn't need to be as central. A lot of these tools in a raid or a Mythic Plus you may not be using all the time, but you'll need to adjust that as you like. But I would encourage you to still maintain all of this information in a way that is clear for you and concise, but is still visible. The one other element I would suggest that I didn't mention in the rotational video because it's less important is that I would prefer to have my utility pieces highlight themselves when they come back from cooldown. Depending on your class, you may have spells that require a lot of time in between abilities, like for example on Paladin Lay on Hands, which has a very long cooldown of 7 minutes versus something that has maybe 30 seconds, or an interrupt on a mob that doesn't have very long. In this case, Hammer of Justice is a minute long. You can see as these cool down, they're going to do just what your rotational pieces would do. They're going to look the very same, except that when they come back off cooldown, I'm going to suggest it might be useful for you to offer some kind of indicator so that you know that your utility piece is ready to go. This may be a sound, it may be a flash, it may be some kind of activation bar like you saw me do just there. Anything that will just give you your brain that little tick of information that the spell is ready, because unlike with the rotational pieces, all of your utility pieces are kind of on demand. You're not likely to immediately press your freedom button on cooldown. Some instances perhaps you will, depending on what's going on. Similarly for any defensives or cleanses or movement, these aren't things that you are going to press as soon as they come off cooldown, so it's nice to have some kind of an indication that they're ready to go. It'll stick in the back of your mind and you'll know that it's ready. So you saw my freedom just come off cooldown, you see my Hammer of Justice is ready to go. It just flicks on a little light bulb in my mind, and then it just goes back to its normal situation. So you can see here within this UI I have at a glance all of the different utility. This looks kind of overwhelming in some regards because it's just a bunch of symbols, but as you use them and practice using them, you'll get used to where to look to check for information. So just like with my rotational video, I talked about whether we should centralize certain kinds of abilities, start them on the left, start them on the right. This is all up to you, but you should make them consistent, especially if you have a multi-classing or you have a many alts. You want to put the same kind of information in the same sort of space on the game. So if you have a dispel of some kind and you heal and also DPS or something, try to keep this information here if you like it on the left, or if you prefer it on the right, and so on and so forth. If you have stuns like a paladin does, or you have an interrupt, you want to put that in some location along this bar, or if you're going to put it up here on the left, in some region that is the same for every single character you use. This will just help with your muscle memory. It'll help you to always look in the right spot, but it still needs to be centralized. Now, what kinds of utility should I be prioritizing as far as showing information? And I think there's 5 major types that you want to be considering. The first, and probably the most important or the most basic, are interrupts. So I have Rebuke here with a little fist going up in the air like this on the Ret Paladin. There's Kick. There's all kinds of interrupts for DPS, and there's for once for shaman as well as for tanks as well. This is one of the most important things for you to be tracking, and I put it out here on the wing so that I can glance down and there's no information in between my rotational side and this corner. So my eye has an easy time moving from the center, just glancing down to see Rebuke is ready to go off cooldown. It's important to have interrupts, or you could say also disruptions, so things like stuns and displacements, as your first thing that you want to go to when you're thinking about utility and developing a utility bar, because it's the one that you will likely be called on to participate in most often. Every single Mythic Plus dungeon and many of the raid encounters have mechanics that call for successive interruption of some kind of spellcasting that's deadly or dangerous for your team. And getting used to pressing this button is absolutely essential, and it's often so important that you will have a person within a Mythic Plus group or a raid actually tracking all of the interrupts available to the team, and they will usually call that out and say who's next in line. So sometimes this information gets used up by a leader of some kind, a raider or a dungeon leader, and that's completely fine. But for you, the player, to have access to that so you know where your interrupt is really useful. We'll talk a little bit more about a note for tracking a bunch of those things for utility things for raid leaders in a moment, but for now, think first about developing your sense of where you want your interrupts to be and also your disruptions. So AoE stuns like Demon Hunter, Cap Totem, those kinds of things. Disruptions like Monk, Circle, Ring of Peace, these kinds of things. Mass Roots if they're necessary. Anything that can interrupt or displace or move or stop a cast, that kind of stuff. You want to be tracking those. That's kind of the most important pieces, I think. The second type of utility is personal defenses. So Paladin has a couple. On Ret, you have a sort of shield, and you also have your personal bubble, which this immunity sometimes gets called up to do extra work in a raid environment or a dungeon where you need to soak a deadly mechanic that would kill other people. Likewise, Ice Block would do this for a mage, or Cloak perhaps for a rogue. These are the two main defensives that are offered to Ret Paladins, and there are defensives for many classes. And there's also some defensives for different races like Dwarf. These personal defenses should also be somewhere centralized in the utility bar or somewhere around here where you can access them, because it is the difference between you living and dying often, and knowing when you have access to it and how much time you have between it can be a lifesaver. So this can include the hard ones like bubbles and blocks and cloaks, and it can also include other personal defensives like potions and, if you like, health stones, those kinds of pieces. If you find yourself dying a lot, especially in raids, but you aren't using health potions or health stones if you have a warlock with your group, these are things that you want to start tracking. The more information you have, the more often you will use it. The more often you use it, the more often you are likely to survive in a serious situation. If you just have that warlock's health stone in your bag and you don't have anywhere to track where it is and you're not used to pressing it, you're very unlikely to be in the habit of pressing it when you're in danger. Far better to overuse it and to track it and see where it is than to never use it and have no way to bring yourself back up in a dire situation. So those personal defensive things, sort of the consumable side, and as well as the hard defensives, are absolutely essential on the utility side. The third one, dispels or decurses. So I have a dispel here as a Ret Paladin, and all of our healer classes also have another tag on their dispel, so they can dispel magic, but many classes can get rid of curses, diseases, poisons, and it's important for you, actually, especially as a non-healer, to think about and have access to where these are. These utilities are best used by the DPS players because they're, generally speaking, a single button that you can press, and it doesn't really interrupt your rotation too much, and it takes a lot of pressure away from your healer core for having to go around and dispel. So there is, for example, lots of instances in raids, and there's one coming up in Calcinathria when healers are called on to actually do dispels because it's magic, and they are already pressured down with that mechanic, and maybe they get a bleed on them, that sort of thing. We want to take away from the weight of those people the issue of dealing with dispelling things. So tracking your own dispels, the ones that a tank or a DPS can take care of is quite useful. The fourth thing that you want to track is in your utility bar are specialty support items. So as a paladin, you have access to a few tools. One's lay on hands, it's almost like a full heal for somebody on a really long cooldown. Bop, which can remove things like bleeds and other horrible problems on somebody else or yourself, and it makes you immune to physical damage. These are sort of specialty items that you might use as a paladin in this case of all specs, and there are other specialty support items in other classes that you might be able to make use of. Things like that have a cooldown that you'd want to track. So think about some of these high-ticket items and make sure that you're tracking them. Finally, the fifth one is movement. So at least Rep Paladin gets access to at least one horse baseline, and the horse is my movement skill. Every class has some version of this, like Blink or Roll or Wraith Walk or Feral Leap or all these kinds of Feral Lunge, these kinds of abilities. And Ghost Wolf form, anything that might have a cooldown associated with it, you want to track that kind of movement. And this is actually one of the biggest DPS increases for all DPS specs, to track their movement and know when they have access to something that'll let them get away from a mechanic or back or to a boss or from a boss. It's massive, 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 especially for range DPS. People who like a lock who's going to take their portal talent, knowing the cooldown on that is so useful because it saves you a lot of time running across the map or something like that. The same thing is true for Blink and many others as well. So get in the habit of tracking your movement. Now, with all 5 of these, it's actually sometimes hard, unless you're in a raid environment, to spend any time practicing their use. So I would actually always recommend a couple things. Come down to the dummies in whatever expansion you're in. Find the raid training dummy, the group dummy for AoE stuff, and there's always usually some kind of tank dummy or Dungeoneer's training dummy it's called, and it'll hit you and do damage to you. This will give you an opportunity to test out some of these pieces while you're in combat, so you can just get used to the muscle memory of pressing your utility. This is pretty important because a lot of these pieces happen only every so often, or as I said at the beginning, on demand. So you're not ready to press them. You're not sort of in the moment getting used to it. So just taking some time at the dummies, not to do your rotation, but to think about your utility and just get used to pressing those buttons is actually a huge boon, and it's really helpful. That covers it for my conversation about utility bars. I just want to take one moment and make a note for raid leaders who are thinking about utility. I would encourage you to set up some kind of information block on your UI that is not conspicuous, that is, it's not plugging up all of this room in the center of your UI, though you may choose for some instances, like the interrupt order, for example, to put that in a nice space. But I would encourage you to keep a bar or set of bars available to track other people's CDs. And this includes, of course, throughput ones like big healer CDs, but it also includes a lot of the utility. And I want you just to encourage you to continue to look down at these pieces and make use of that space visually. Get used to looking down at it and see who has blessing sacrifice ready. See whose block is up. See whose turtle is ready to go. See who has a stun. Check out who's got movement speed. If we have, Tiger's Lust from some monks. All of these abilities, it's really useful as a raid leader that you have these available to you so that you can help people to use their stuff for the good of the group. If you don't do that, and they're not used to using it, oftentimes moments will be missed when you could have aided one of your raiders or Mythic Plus members and gotten them out of some bad situation, or bopped them and saved them from dying, or so on and so forth. And the list goes on. And a lot of raid wipes come about because people are not prepared to look at the group. They are tunnel visioned and focused very much on their own task, which is hard enough in this game. There's lots of mechanics. But as a raid leader, I'd encourage you to grab a bunch of that information so that you can easily assist your members in making the best use of their utility. Okay, thanks for watching, and look forward to the next video where we talk a little bit more about other features of your UI. Have a great day.